So now I want to walk you through the syntax and go through some of the information about how we measure things in psychology, because often people don't understand how we quantify behavior and how we run statistics. So first, I want to let you know that I'll be going in between three different screens in SPSS. It'll be hard for you to see this, but this is called the syntax screen. We also have the actual data set. This is the variable view with the data. I'm sorry, the data view with the data, and then the variable view that shows all of our variables. And then finally, we have the output. So when I run analyses, we'll go through what the syntax output. So I'm going to go ahead and shut this one down so we can start from scratch. Okay, so first let's start off with our syntax. And the first thing I want to do is tell you a little bit about the sample. So we're going to run what are called demographic variables because they're just describing the sample. This helps us to see who we can generalize the population to. So this syntax is going to provide some frequencies for these different variables like age and gender. It will also give us an output about standard deviations, minimum and maximum values, and then measures of central tendency. If you remember mean, that's your average, median, and mode. These are all your measures of central tendency. Your median is the value that's right in the middle of your sample, and your mode is the answer that's answered the most. So you press this green arrow after you highlight it, and the output comes up. So here are your demographic statistics. First, you need to look at your sample size. N is a symbol for sample, and you can see that it varies just a little bit across, and that just means that a few people didn't answer some questions. So let's go through the demographics. First, I want to talk a little bit about samples and populations. So in statistics, we are assuming that our sample represents a certain population. We're assuming that it's a random sample, so we can make some generalizations from our findings. Now, it's important to acknowledge any bias you might have in the data. And bias means, it sounds bad, but it really just means that what does it generalize to? So, for example, bias in our data is because this is an upper level online class at UNF. And so who can we generalize to? We aren't representing all of the majors. We do have psychology majors. We have a lot of pre-med, some nursing, physical therapy, but I don't believe we have any engineering, so we have to consider how we're slightly biased because we're not representing every kind of student. We also don't have many freshmen. I think there's one true freshman by hours in this class. In fact, let's look down here at what level we can see. Here we go. So we do have one freshman. We have quite a few juniors and not so many seniors. Now in the spring, when I teach this, I usually have more seniors. So this is interesting how this semester differs from other semesters. We can see that we can generalize mainly to a female population. We don't have a good representation of males. And then when we look at the age, we can see that quite a few in terms of the distribution of ages. We have many people who are less than 22, but we go all the way up to 53. So this gives us some information on who we can generalize to. In general, the higher the sample size, the better, because that better represents a population and you're more likely to find statistical significance. So let's walk through some of these contextual factors. I already talked about age and gender and level. In terms of, do we have people graduating this semester? Just 16, so congratulations to those 16 people out there. Let's look at how many hours are you taking. We can see that quite a few are taking 12 and 13 hours, and in fact, when we scroll back up, we can see the mean for how many hours you're taking this semester is 12.36. Now, the standard deviation is 3.34, and for a brief description of what standard deviation is, that helps you to see how much people vary around the mean. So for a small standard deviation, we can see that people are pretty close, around 12. But look at something like how many hours outside of school do you work? And you can see that on average, people are considered part-time, so 20 hours would be considered part-time. But look at the standard deviation of 14.6. So we have a wide variation. We have some people, if we look down at the frequency distribution, 31 individuals who don't work at all, and then we have quite a few, if we start here around 40 hours, that are working full-time. So we have a lot of variability, which is well represented when we look around this higher standard deviation. In terms of relationship status, that could contribute to stress, as you know from your readings on social support and coping. We see that we're pretty equally split between being single and in a relationship, with a small number being married. And then in terms of how much people are exercising, again, this relates to health and can contribute to stress. We see that we have over a third of our sample are consistent exercisers. About a quarter are inconsistent but feel pretty good about their regime, their exercise regime, and then about 16% say they don't have one. And then when we ask how often people are exercising, we can see that it's about equally split between very often and rarely. More individuals say often, and a small minority say never. So that gives you some information about what our sample looks like. This sample is drawn from 3 online classes taught by myself, Dr. Nicholson, Dr. Ames, and Dr. Bruce, and then also some individuals from Dr. Weatherspoon's in-person course. So now let me explain some things that I had to do. One thing I had to do is with this syntax, it's called dichotomizing variables. And what that means is if you have a continuous variable that ranges, so for example, if we're looking at age, and we saw that that ranged all the way from 18 years to 53 years, and we want to cause it a split. And so in this case, I did a median split. And I looked at the median, which was 21 years. And through this syntax, I said to create a new variable called age med for age median, where if the individual was less than 21 in the new variable, they were assigned a 1. If they were greater than 21 in the new variable, they were assigned a 2. So we will see in some medical journals and in psychology as well, people do median splits to run different analyses. And in our case, I created a median split for juniors and seniors because I wanted to be able to run a t-test to compare the means. So we're doing simple analyses for this project. We're doing t-test and correlations. Correlations compare to continuous variables, whereas a t-test will look at 2 groups and compare the means in the 2 groups. So by dichotomizing these different variables, I was able to run a t-test. So now let me run you through what our syntax looks like for our different measures. And as I mentioned, individuals often don't understand how psychology creates numbers, a quantitative we do quantitative research. So this is for the life orientation test. That is a measure of optimism, and we we reverse coded some of the items. And the reason we do this is you've probably all been asked to fill out a survey, and you just start circling down one side because you know what they're asking. You know they want you to answer very good all the way down. By asking some questions in the positive and some in the negative, then this helps us to ensure that what we get from individuals is true. They really carefully consider the question. So for the optimism question, some were asking about optimism, some questions were asking about pessimism, and the pessimism variables we recoded or reverse coded them. So when we scored, higher scores are indicative of more optimism. We have a coping humor scale, which also had some reverse scoring. And then we had 8 different subscales for ways of coping. So all the items that you answered about the different ways that you cope, they were assigned to different meaningful subscales. So for example, we have both passive and active ways of coping. We have confrontive coping, distancing, self-controlling, seeking social support, accepting responsibility, escape avoidance, planful problem solving, positive reappraisal. I'll be asking you some questions to sort of differentiate those passive versus active approaches to coping and how that relates to stress. Here is the perceived stress questionnaire with some reverse coding. Now, what's important about this questionnaire is the idea that it is your perception and that some individuals might perceive higher stress, whereas others could be going through the same amount of stress but not perceive it as bad. So you might have one classmate that just has a few things going on in their life but they really can't handle it, and another classmate who has lots of things going on and they seem to be able to handle it much better. The undergraduate stress questionnaire is it's counting up the number of stressors that individuals have in their lives. So if you remember that long list of things that you could choose from. And then finally, the health questionnaire, I was interested in your physical symptoms, so we can see if those who identify that they have more physical symptoms, they have more ailments in their life, if they also have more stress in their lives. So that finishes up for this video. In the next video, I will be going through the outcomes for the hypotheses.